Thank you for joining us today, both of you, Nitin and Naya. I think my first question is going to be on every time I've spoken to CEOs in the last 2 decades, the one thing that they all say that gives them sleepless nights is the issue of talent. Talent is one of the biggest factors that gives them sleepless nights. Given that in the last couple of decades, I think, particularly in the last 10 years or so, I think this whole equation between employees and employers has undergone a sharp shift. And the equation is not what it used to be a few decades ago, where the sort of employer called all the shots. Is there a kind of a friction that has emerged over the years as the workforce has gotten younger? Expectations, aspirations have increased, and now you have things like Glassdoor, which impact employee perception of companies as well. Nitin, would you like to go first, since you deal with a lot of companies as a consulting firm, and how do you see this shift in this entire equation between employers and employees?
No, thanks for that. The way I would actually start with this is, yes, I think the equation is shifting, yeah, but I actually wouldn't call it that way. I think one of the big problems, the way I actually see this is, I think, for now a couple of decades, we've used this word which is called war for talent. I think if you fight this war, someone's going to lose in this. And I think ideally in this environment, for it to work well, both employees and employers have to win. That's the best way forward on this one. So I would actually, like I personally work with clients to say, let's park this word outside and let's create a process or a mechanism of actually enabling this whole ecosystem. So, the way I would look at this is, even consumer needs have been changing every decade, every 5, 10, 15 years in that sense. I don't think marketing departments and companies ever went to war with customers. They actually figured out a way to kind of enable their products and their ecosystems to be able to kind of get the right product, the right value in front of consumers to be able to, grow, build, evolve, and continue to be successful. So I think the first shift that I actually think is because language often tends to be generative. You see that again and again, and then you land up there. This is not about war. This is about understanding genuinely and deeply what your employees want, and that need is shifting. 100 years back, the only way to do this was to get people to work. I think more than 100 years back, Henry Ford said this: the only color or the car that you would buy is black, as long as that's the only thing that's quite out there. So in that context, I think deeply understand what your employees want, and then build an ecosystem that actually makes them successful. You don't go to war with your stakeholder, and employees truly are your stakeholders. You don't go to war with them.
No, I didn't mean war, but the point is that there is a friction, and there is no denying that this friction exists, whether it's gig workers or it is young professionals, whether it's flexibility, whether it is women. Naya, we've discussed this before, right? It's taken women a long time to kind of get some of the benefits that they wanted, whether it's maternity leave, etc. How do you see, as a young company, when the kind of people you employ, do you see that, that you need to be more flexible, you need to be more open, you need to kind of listen more? How is this whole equation between employee versus employers playing out at your company?
So it's a great question. And I want to kind of lay out the context in which we operate to provide some color to my comments. So at the Good Glam Group, we are South Asia's largest beauty personal care unicorn. Digital first beauty personal care unicorn. And within that, we have a bunch of verticals, right? So one is, of course, our beauty personal care brands. We have a media, actually the largest media assets, more than 200 million MAUs is what we reach through our media assets, Popex or Scoop Whoop, Miss Malini, Baby Chakra, etc. Tweak, we recently acquired. We have a creator vertical, which is where we interact with more than 1.5 million influencers. And then, of course, we have a communities vertical where we reach about 200 million community members, right? So that's sort of the spectrum of the group. Now, within that, overall, if I were to look at numbers, now coming to your question on women, right? We have 65% women in our teams, which is extraordinary when we are thinking about a digital-first play in consumer, right? At our leadership role, there are two co-founders, me and Priyanka, who are women, and Vidarpan, right? So CXXO roles as well, women, right? So I think we are maybe an outlier as I think about the Indian consumer tech, Indian tech ecosystem in general. I think what that basically translates to is two things. One, you talk about the flexibility and adaptability, right? I think we've naturally kind of structured our processes, including like right from the corporate team to the beauty advisor team to the makeup artist team, etc., to ensure a lot of flexibility, because in those roles, it helps massively. It's a competitive edge to have women. So the entire organization structure is focused on ensuring that women get flexibility, very, very progressive mat leave policies. We also have a pat leave policy, right, to ensure that flexibility is really playing out. The second, I was discussing internally in the speaker room with a fellow speaker, was also the reskilling, upskilling piece to it, right? Because, there's what we've obviously learned to do over time is we've learned to, take the more mundane, the more functional tasks, sort of build in machines into that, right? The more creative, problem-solving, design aspect is now what we are basically working with our teams on. And that makes us more efficient when it comes to creativity, right? And to meet the next boundary of creativity, of new product development, etc. So a lot of reskilling, upskilling that we're investing in on that paradigm. The third is, of course, all the influencers, the communities we work with, which are not part of our teams, technically, right? But those are basically what drive the engine forward. And over there, what we've learned to do is create a set of incentives and create a set of we talked a little bit about the soft pieces of building teams, right? Which is where you create status, you create gamification, you create rewards, which are not linked to a role, a formal role in the organization, but which lead to the outcomes you need from them as an organization, right? So I think that has been the paradigm we operate in, and I'm happy to speak more about that. It's a very different paradigm. That's why I just wanted to set
You
context.
should actually speak more. For instance, and that's my next question, that India produces the largest number of graduates, engineers, etc. Are they industry ready? And that's, either of you can go first, whoever. Do you want to go first, Nitin?
You want to go first? Yeah. So, the way I would I think it's, the outcome of, where you land up with your education is, I think, in a manner that people have grown up over a period of time. I think, there's an overemphasis in terms of technical education and a bunch of things. So to your point, millions of engineers, graduates, MBA, B school guys out in the market. We run a business which is, helping companies assess talent as they bring them in. And, interestingly, when talent comes in, I don't think companies genuinely miss technical skills. There is obviously some degree of onboarding and teaching processes and systems of how companies work. I think fundamentally companies miss the fact that people haven't over a period of time built learning agility. They've just grown up one way of doing things, and then you hit a roadblock and you say you have to unlearn and relearn. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is, increasingly more and more companies are talking about the fact that people don't come in and create communication with impact. That genuinely has to be retaught in many ways in that context. So are people ready when they come in? I think technically, more or less, many companies are building an ecosystem of making people technically a little bit more proficient. You learn something. How do you create textbook into something else? But I think an overwhelming focus over next couple of years, decades in India, genuinely has to be around the soft skills. And there is no way to do this other than partnerships. Big companies, I would say, have to first step in to be able to lead the charge and do this. Mid-sized companies, early-stage companies have many other priorities and, don't have bandwidth enough to do that. But I think early-stage companies have to lead that ecosystem to say, how do we partner and build up the more softer elements of what comes to place.
Right. Naya, how about you? I mean, how do you see when you sort of onboard people, and since you have a whole ecosystem and not just employees on your roles, what's your view on that?
I'm also very involved with ensuring more and more women are in tech, as you know, with the Niti Aayog and with. So I think the two sort of trends I want to quickly talk about, right? To your point, 50-50 is the entry point of women in STEM into IT. Right? So you actually have like an equal, if not a disproportionately more representation of women in the entry level of IT, right? In IT roles and jobs. What changes is, of course, when you get married or when you have a child, and that's when, if you look at key leadership roles, you have less than 8 to 9% of women in key leadership roles, right? So the base of the attrition, the bulk of the attrition happens at a certain period in time. And being a former consultant myself, I think if you just take an 80-20 approach, if you just solve for that, right? You pretty much solve for the entire women in workforce, women in IT situation, right? Because if you look at it, where are women employed? They're employed in BFSI and IT. So you pretty much solve for it if you solve for IT in a big way, right? And hence, I think the two things that organizations need to think more and more about is one is, for women in particular, what is the enabling environment, the reskilling, the back to work environment you're creating for women when they go on mat leave. And I agree fully with Nitin when he talks about partnerships there, because not every module, every learning curriculum can be created in-house. You have to figure out who your partners there are and really make that work. And number two, I think a social currency. I think many times as organizations, we forget that we're dealing with people. And I think that's where organizations thrive, when you really get to know your people really well and what matters to them. I think, ensuring that you have these stories of success come out of women who've done really well when they've rejoined the workplace, and that's setting the narrative for the other women who are considering mat leave or considering taking time out, etc. I think those are really important stories to bring to the mainstream, especially in organizations. I won't even talk about, I think, the more sort of clinical approaches we take, because I think that is being done, that is happening, but it's not working. I think these two things, if we really sort of just focus and really build very enabling ecosystems at a certain point in time for women in the workspace, as well as number two, really start bringing out stories and start celebrating organizations that have done a damn good job of doing it. I think that sets a narrative for the other organizations to follow.
Right. Talking about flexibility, which is, I think, a key trend that has emerged post the pandemic. Nitin, do you feel that, what is your view on flexibility? And because most of the IT company CEOs that I talk to tell me that, globally, I think most companies have brought back people to work. It's at least 3 days a week. But in India, IT campuses still don't even have 20% occupancy yet, because people are simply not willing to return to work. And there are various factors for that. How is flexibility being viewed by companies today?
So the way I would say this is, I agree. I think at the moment, if you look at the big companies or even big to small companies, I think lesser number of tech talent is coming to work than everywhere else. I don't know. If you look at sales employees in your organization, they have to be with their customers, have to be somewhere else. But it's tech talent coming back. If you look at, but outside of tech, most people are back to work. You look at pharma companies, manufacturing, bank, literally just about everywhere else. I think the first shift that's actually happened is, I think the fundamental one is, I think the element of flexibility is here to stay. Now the question is, what does that mean? In some places it could mean being at work 1 day a week. In some places 3 or 4 days a week. There's a new saying in London which says Thursday is a new Friday. No one comes to office on Fridays, and people come to, and a bunch of stuff is kicked up on Thursdays in terms of what's happening. So I think the first thing is, how do you work in that element of flexibility? I don't think people have to come to work only for sake of showing up. There has to be more than that. And what is that, when you come to work, what does it really mean? So I think that's the definition that companies have to go through, but flexibility is here to stay. In general, I think this is a huge opportunity for India in that sense. If you go the gig model, the hybrid model, the flexibility model, the problem India has is we have, when you pass out of B schools, there are 4 cities to go and work in. Now, how do you get to 20 cities? How do you create infrastructure, ecosystem, employment in 20 cities? I think flexibility, gig, and a bunch of things would actually create that opportunity for people to be sitting out of, whether it's Goa or Turicon, or whether it's Bhubaneswar, or whether it's Guwahati, to actually sit and work. And I think it fundamentally means good for our economy. When you have jobs, and when you have employment, and potentially mid to high income jobs sitting out of those places. So I think that's the direction. Now, how do companies enable it in different places? I think is for each one to its own unique story.
I just want to build on what you said, Nitin. I think flexibility takes on different contours as well today, right? One is, of course, as Nitin very beautifully pointed out, the location flexibility. But the second flexibility is whether, and there was a full debate about it, right, in India Inc., which was about whether people who are fully employed or have employment agreements with a certain organization can do, freelancing for another, for some other organization, or whether, what is that paradigm, right? Because I think with the location flexibility, that whole thing about sort of checking in, checking out of office, and therefore knowing your accountability for those 9 hours a day, that is gone, right? It's more about now a trust-first approach. So I think the workaround that we have sort of aligned is that now we've kind of restructured our employment agreements. To your point earlier, where you mentioned what happens when you have, an influencer set of that segment, right? Or where you have folks who are extremely creative, who are part of our teams, but also have another persona as a creator on YouTube or a creator on Instagram. What happens to them? When they're doing different brand agreements, but also pitching brand agreements to, let's say, a client internally. So we've actually been reworking our employment agreements to basically talk about thresholds. Because I think the answer for us has been to explicitly address it head on, versus sweep it under the rug, because then it kind of takes on a different form, right? And I think the idea again is, with more and more, I mean, like the singularity is here pretty much, right? So I think you basically want to ensure that the very creative, extremely talented, extremely like left brain thinking people are actually part of your team, not leaving your team because you have a certain rigid structure. So I think for me, flexibility has taken on different contours in the paradigm that we work in as well.
Right. Talking about the labor code, I mean, labor reforms have been quite awaited in India for a very long time, and Ms. Singhal spoke at length about it, and which was quite interesting to know about all the kind of thinking that has gone behind it. You asked a question about how much time would companies have to enact these new rules. Where do you see this going? And do you see, how is the equation going to be skewed? What are the kind of issues that the labor code addresses? And what are the parts that, could perhaps be open for discussion?
So, firstly, with the caveat, I'm not an expert in this area. I think a lot of it is about legal and law and things like that. The question I had for her was essentially, I think the only concern the industry has is how much of time would they get to change. It may seem very simplistic to change your salary structures to something else, but how does it work back to your tech ecosystem, your payrolls, and a bunch of things. So I think that change management space has to come in. It could be slightly easier for some Indian companies. You have all decision making here, but imagine if you're a multinational which has a Workday and a SuccessFactors, a bunch of stuff needs to happen back in Seattle or Washington or London or Tokyo and stuff, and it's not going to be easy. So I think that's the question. But I think at the core of it, I think the principle that the labor code is trying to address is simplicity, trying to get more relevant in today's context, genuinely trying to answer questions around gig, encouraging diversity, Yeah, so I think in that sense, I think I would call it a monumental step in the right direction. Obviously, the best book on strategy is execution. So in terms of how it really happens is, I would say, stuff to watch out for.
Naya, what about you? As a CEO, how do you see this impacting your contractual agreements with employees, etc.?
So, very similar to, I think, what Nitin said there as well. I think we'll have to kind of wait and watch and, obviously consult with the relevant folks to see how this impacts us. And, I think, however, it is a step in the right direction. I think it is becoming a lot more progressive. It's taking into account all the real challenges we're all seeing today, right? Or the real opportunities we see today. I think a broader question, I think, especially the part about ensuring more and more women, participation in the workforce. I mean, I think it's now a national question. Right? Because if India has to move from being a $5 trillion consumer economy to being like a $3 trillion, to being like a $5.5, $7 trillion consumer economy in the next literally election cycle, you need more women in the workforce with financial independence, buying products, sort of being part of the story playing out, right? So I think whatever we're seeing play out right now is not just done to. One part, of course, is to ensure more relevance, transparency, ease of doing business, etc. But I think the other piece is extremely important, which is inclusion. So I'll have to obviously get into what the implication for our group is. But I think on an overall level, quite optimistic about seeing this play out well.
The other thing I would add to this is, I genuinely feel, I think over the next couple of decades, I don't think India is going to run short of capital. Obviously, there'll be challenges around it. I think India will genuinely run short of people to come to work, to be able to deliver right amount of skills, capabilities for businesses to be successful. So if you look at that broad, big picture, 2-decade view, 3-decade view, I think it's a step in the right direction. In that context, the fact, if you have to solve for talent supply, to your point, there is absolutely no alternative to the fact you have to get more women to work. Whether it's the social infrastructure or business infrastructure, it's been either unfair or something else, and you need to get better with some of that stuff. And in many other ways, I think companies have to solve for talent supply. So whether it's more women at work and making them not getting to work, but making them successful and making them sit in boardrooms over a period of time. Then how do you tap into other talent ecosystems? One of the other things, many companies are doing is, someone spoke of Agniveer, but even historically, a couple of thousand army officers retire every year with some of the best skills possibly in the market in terms of what they could bring to. How do you make them employable? They retire between 40 and 45, 47, 50. So companies have to identify different talent segments, be able to use those relevant skills and bring them back in. I think in that context, it's absolutely the step in the right direction.
That brings me to a question. When I started my career, I remember going to a very large conglomerate's headquarters, and I wanted to use the washroom, and they didn't have a ladies' loo. And I was stunned that they didn't have. And they said because we don't employ women, so there's no need for a women's washroom. Cut to 2023, things are much better now, significantly better. But yet, I find it strange that even sectors like BFSI are finding it hard to take the women ratio of women beyond 20%. They're struggling. Somebody is at 15%, somebody is at 10%, somebody is at 20%, but it's just not moving the needle. What is the reason for that?
So, the way I would answer is, I would say, firstly, I think there is change happening. I think the question is, what do you measure? If you say, I look at my whole organization, 50,000 people, 40% women, that looks good. But I think the most, progressive organizations are not saying that number only. What they're saying is that every segment in the organization, where what's the percentage? When we look at a high potential talent pool, what's the percentage? When we look at a succession pool of people who would take up management roles, what's the pool? And that's where the real answer to this is. And you need to start solving for some of those things. But I fundamentally see, I think change is happening. To your point, 20 years back, you had that problem. And, in 2022, 23, we're reading news of, combat pilots and tank commanders and many of the others being women. So I think change is happening. I think the best way to do this is to celebrate that change. Sometimes let the noise be a little ahead of what's actual. I think noise creates space and it actually forces people to catch up. So I'm personally a big, an advocate of that, to let noise quite happen. We're in the middle of a huge research. I think it's India's potentially largest DEI research that we're doing. The idea is not to capture just, sets of 5 or 6 different elements and capture percentages, but to look at practices that actually make inclusion impactful. And we genuinely think, I think there is good work happening and we need to celebrate some of that good work.
Exactly. In fact, I'll just kind of say something here. I was talking to a production house that makes ad films, and I was asking them about, at one time, again, advertising had a lot of women, but very few women heading the corporations or ad agencies, etc. And what I heard today is that now, when, let's say, a global agency, global FMCG company, let's say P&G comes to them for an ad film, they insist that out of the, they drill down to the level where they say that out of 4 ADs or working on the creatives, the creative team, 40% or 50% have to be women. It's come, and I think this change is being driven by larger multinational organizations. Even when it comes to multinationals are looking for filling top jobs, they ensure that there are at least 50% of the candidates are women. Is this happening across the board in corporate India when you are looking to hire? Do you give this mandate to people that 40% or 50% of the hiring that we do has to be women? You have to look for those people even if they're not coming to you and applying for those jobs.
So I'll come to the specific question just a bit, but I think it comes back to a very important point, right? This whole thing about equality versus equity, right? And I think many times when we say that, men and women need to be equal, that's not going to be the case, because the way the workplace was devised, and the industrial revolution, everything was devised was actually in a man's paradigm. Correct. So I think, when you have to ensure that women are part of the workforce, you have to fundamentally rethink. Now, of course, with fundamental rethinking, you bring up questions of equity, and you also bring up questions of progressive legislation. If I look at the independent director, the board act, right? I mean, we went literally from having pretty much an abysmal number of women at board representation to having, I think, 12 to 15% today, because it was mandated. Like, you could not run a company if you did not have a woman on the board. Now, what did that lead to? It basically led to exactly what you said, which is that the boards would then go out and scout women directors out. In fact, there are now coaching programs to say, hey, how can you become a director if you're a woman? And let me sort of equip you with the right skills, understanding balance sheets, understanding P&L statements, understanding like questioning, etc., with CEOs, etc., to prepare you for that role. Now, I think that is that level of push. And I think legislation certainly achieves it to a large extent. But I think a very fundamental push is needed. One of these pushes is, I think, mandating our teams, which we do, to look for, and in fact, we do CV vetting, where we get an equal representation, but we cut out the names. So we don't know the gender of the person we are actually going to be meeting. So we just look at literally like, the resume without the names. And we also know that there's an equal mix of men and women in that resume. So I think when you think about inclusion, it requires a fundamental rethink, because the structures are not set to be equal. And therefore, to make it equal, we first have to be equitable.
And if I could, the only thing I would add to that is, I think sometimes, it's my personal point of view, I think it's too late to start teaching companies about what they need to do on DAI when people are at work. I think it needs to fundamentally become part of our, curriculum ecosystem, or in some form and manner a part of that for it to be genuinely impactful. In some of the research that we're doing, I think companies are going back, and actually some companies are going back and doing that with colleges and going back and teaching in B schools about their values, about their standards, about what it means. And to your point in terms of, companies are going back and doing things as simple as, to the point you mentioned, a bunch of our office infrastructure was designed 100 years back. So simple things like in terms of, temperature that needs to be in rooms, height of workstations, a bunch of other things. So I think that change is happening. I think it's just a question of celebrating some of the change that's out there. That's the way I would actually see it.
And with that, we are running out of time. But I still will ask one last question. That I was talking to another, CEO of a very large private bank, and we were talking about inclusion and diversity. And typically, when you talk of diversity and inclusion, most people assume it's only gender diversity and inclusion. But diversity is about a lot of other things. And the fact, what that bank was struggling with, they said, is that we want to bring in people of different religions, for instance, but we don't know how to ask people, or sexual orientation for that matter, because that's the next frontier for a lot of them, to become a place which is friendly to people of different orientations, people of different beliefs, people of different faiths, and they want to increase representation of diverse sections along these lines, barring gender. But they said, we don't know how to do it, because what if I ask somebody, even if we are doing an anonymous survey asking people what your sexual orientation is, will our workforce like it? We don't know. We want to increase it, but we don't know how. Do you both have a view on this one?
I can take it. So, this makes business sense, actually, if you really think about it, right? I think the fear that a lot of large corporates and young ventures today have is the fear of dying in oblivion as a dinosaur, because you don't understand what the people on the ground are thinking. And this narrative has changed with consumers, with sensibilities, with their appreciation, in fact, preference for brands that practice this out, right? So I think it makes overall
it started
business
with
sense.
that, because one of the LGBTQ community had gone to open a bank account, and they were shunned by saying that, you are not entitled for a joint account because they were partners.
Correct.
Same gender. And that went on Twitter, and then it escalated into a massive chaos internally in the bank. And that's when these people said, our times, we didn't know these things existed. Now we are supposed to address it. We don't know how.
Yeah, and I think the main thing that works, right, is going back to whether, and this is now a new paradigm that we are operating. All of our employees are actually the ambassadors to our company. So it's not like, you have this employee branding team that's basically doing employee branding and employer branding anymore. Every single employee in our teams are actually our spokespeople. They have a voice. LinkedIn is that soapbox. Twitter is that soapbox. Instagram is that soapbox. Or Reddit is that soapbox, right? So I think keeping that in mind, the more we can get our teams, and for that you will start internally. So without even starting externally and saying outside in, how do I create this perception? Inside in, have you create that perception of safety, right? So the people who are already there, are they comfortable enough to announce their sexual preference or, their sexuality, or talk about what is the problem statement that they have? So I think it actually is an inside in problem first. If you solve for that, obviously, like, given that what the ratios are, you will obviously already have people, of the type that you're trying to hire, except that you haven't discovered them yet. So I think it requires a bit more introspection, and then using that introspection and creating that safety with your existing teams to then have them become evangelists, right? I think that is the onus we see as leaders today.
That survey in that bank is still being discussed and debated internally. But any last comments, Nitin?
No, I would agree. I would say, I think listen deeply, create a safety net. I think, to your first question in terms of what's changing, I think fundamentally it's about trust. It's the new currency. So, you need to build on it. Some people say it's in short supply. I would say it's a question of how you run organizations. You can print as much as you want in that context. So, yeah, that's what I would say. I think if you listen deeply and create that trust, it works. And genuinely, I think there are companies out there that are doing very impressive work in this space.
Right. I hope everybody's been listening deeply, because that's the key takeaway. And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you so much for having been such a great audience. Thank you, Naya, and thank you, Nitin.